So when you print out your paper, you want to make sure that you measure it. Just because in the computer CAD we had our right dimensions, you need to make sure that when it prints it's the right dimension. So I just printed out my sheet here, and I thought this was 24 centimeters, but now you can see it's actually only 23. So there's a mistake here, and this is only 3.3 instead of 3.5 thick. And the reason why was because I didn't print it to scale. I accidentally printed it to fit. So I'll show you what happens when you do that. But so make sure to double check. So now it is 24 wide, and my inner dimension is 3.5 centimeters. So make sure before you just make all your cuts that you double check your printed picture from your CAD so that you're using the correct dimensions.
So when you have your PDF open and you go to print, make sure that your selection is not fit, but it's actual size. Because if you do fit, it will shrink the scale, and that's why on the one print I had actually 23 centimeters instead of 24, even though in CAD it was 24. So double check that when you go to print, you're printing an actual size.
Okay, so now that we've measured our truss and we make sure that it actually meets the required dimension, what I'm going to do is I'm going to label all of my joints, and that way I can keep track of these members when I cut them. So I want to show you how to cut some members. So one thing I don't recommend doing is using a pen. Even if it's a thin Sharpie, you'll see what happens is it bleeds. So it becomes hard to detect the actual edge that you want to cut. So I'd recommend that you use a mechanical pencil instead of a pen, because it's going to leave a much nicer mark that won't bleed. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut for you member BC, and I did kind of a complicated joint which may or may not be advantageous, but I was thinking here I want to maximize my adhesion surface area. Now, one word of advice is that if it's too complicated of a joint and you can't get really flush or members tight together, then it's actually not worth it. So you're losing the advantage of the increased surface area with increased difficulty to manufacture. So I'm going to go ahead and line this up, and you notice it's kind of hard to see. So I know that this point right here, it meets there. So I'm actually kind of just eyeballing this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a little bit back. So when I go ahead and cut this, I'm not going to cut straight on my mark. I'm going to cut a little bit off, and we'll sand it down because we can't add any material, but we can remove material. The other advice is don't cut at an angle. Make sure you're cutting perfectly perpendicular to your member. Otherwise, you're not going to get good adhesion. So go ahead and take your razor, line it up a little bit off from the line you just cut, and not by much, because you don't want to sand too much, but just enough to give you a surface to sand down. And I'm going to actually go ahead and first check that that angle even works. So I'm going to move it in here, and now that I see it, it's like, okay, I did kind of a bad job. It's not meeting quite right. So I can actually kind of cut it on the fly. Go straight down, and that's a little bit better. But then what I'm going to do is come over here, get my piece of sandpaper. I'm actually going to sand it down. Make sure your paper is on a flat surface and you're holding your wood at the kind of correct angle. And you want to go, now this is always going to be perpendicular to the grain, so that's not an issue here. But just take a couple, maybe make a couple, remove a little bit of material at a time and see how you're doing. Okay, so that's still looking a little funny, and I might actually just, if it's all the same, I might just redo my entire cut. So now that I've seen it again, I don't quite like it. So I get my razor blade, make sure I'm perfectly cutting down vertical, Gonna remeasure, and that looks a lot better. I'm still gonna give it a little bit of sanding. That'll make that surface a little bit better for when I go to glue it. Okay. And then what I wouldn't recommend is cutting both ends at the same time. So I'm not going to even mark off that second end until I've gotten the first one correct, because you just saw I did a couple adjustments and then I would have had to remark that second end. So it's not really worth it. So now one point here is this is a really tricky cut that I made. So what I might just do is right where it meets in the middle, you see how it goes up and then in. I'm just gonna cut away that material first and then work on it. So I'm cutting a little bit behind. And let's measure it to make sure. Okay, so I did give myself a little bit of material to sand down. Go ahead and sand that down. Line it up, and now it's looking really good. And then you can see from this other end of the joint where it's gonna meet right there. So I'm gonna head, and I can also see where this joint comes in. So I'm gonna kind of like interpolate between those 2 points with my mark. And remember, you can always sand material down, but you can't put it back. So give yourself a little bit of space. And I did that on purpose this time because I wasn't super confident of how I marked it. So yeah, I've got quite a lot to sand down, but that's okay because I can easily remove material. So let's sand that down. So that's actually looking pretty nice. So I've got my member. Now what you don't want to do is just put it away and then forget about it, because you'll forget which member this belongs to. So before you just put it away, save yourself some time with having to see, oh, which one is it? And go ahead and label it. So this is member B, C. And actually now I might use a marker because the pencil is a little light and I don't care if it bleeds for this. So that's member BC. I want to be able to see that very easily. And so that's how we would go about cutting all of the joints. So after you're done making all your cuts, what you're going to want to do is cut out your main truss and then tape it nice and flat down to the foam core. And then you're going to get the wax paper and you're going to tape it and tape it really nice and snug and tight over the top so that when we glue our members down, they're not going to stick to the paper. So you see now on the back I've taped it nice and tight all the way. And then on the front side, you don't have to cut off the excess if you don't want. But now I have a surface that will not be stuck to by the glue. Okay, so now I'm going to assemble. Now that I got all my joints, I'm going to go ahead and assemble it. And off to the side, what you should do is, so don't put the glue on your foam core with your wax paper. Get a sheet of wax paper, and off to the side, what I'll do is I'll dip my members, and it doesn't need a lot, just a little bit, in the glue, dip each end, and then I'll begin to set them up. And when I get them in place, what you're gonna do is pin them into where they will overlap. So one good idea is to make sure you apply the pins close to the joints, because you want to apply the force to make sure you're getting good adhesion, good bonding right there at the joint. So you might play with it if you overpin, and actually I'm going to bring in another member right here. And you have about 5 minutes for the secure time on the epoxy. So that seems like a lot, but it's not a whole lot of working time. So you don't want to rush it, but you also don't want to work super slow. So I'm taking my time. You don't want to add too much glue. So too much glue is actually not a good thing. You can always dab it away with another piece of balsa wood. Okay, so once you get everything in place, you're going to want to go back on all of your members and push them all down. So make sure they're nice and flat. Make sure none of them are popping up. And then if you have any, if it hasn't quite set on you, you can do some minor adjustments to get everything to, so here is nice and flat. I'm liking that. One thing I might do is some of these joints, if you didn't get them quite cut perfectly, is go ahead and take a little extra toothpick and kind of add in as you see fit, maybe just a little bit more adhesive to make that joint a really nice and strong joint. So go ahead and do that once you've completed it. So if you think there's any gaps, kind of paint them in that way that you have a really nicely and well bonded joints. Now what I will say is you don't want an excess amount of glue because we're going to have to come in here and sand these back down to get a good bond wood to wood for the cross members. So don't make your life too hard. So go ahead and wipe away any excess if you've gone too much. You really just want to get it in between any gaps. And one thing I do want to say though is now that I've got this here, I'm going to let it sit ideally overnight. So ideally you're not working on this the night before it's due because this needs time to cure and harden. So I'd like to let this sit overnight before I take it off and work on my next section. So now that my bridge has been able to dry overnight, I pull it off, and what you'll notice is that the joints, they're pretty good, but there's a lot of glue left over. And what we want is when we bond this to the other bridge with our cross members, the glue is going to soak up into these joints, but if it's closed off by the other glue from our previous joint operation, then we're not going to get a good bond and we might get a shear failure. So what you're going to want to do is kind of go in and take a look at your joints and clean them up. So kind of cut off any excess glue that's left on your joint. So kind of got some here. Careful, don't cut at yourself. So don't try to cut towards your own finger. So I don't want you cutting your finger while you're doing this. So cut away from your finger. But yeah, so what I'm gonna do is go ahead and just scuff up the joints. And the one thing to be careful is that there's gonna be a lot more resistance on the glue than your member. So you don't wanna thin the members to the side of the glue. So try to apply an even pressure, but only on the glue, and don't sand down your member. So there's no rush. You can take your time on this. And feel it and say, okay, I've got down to wood there, maybe a little bit more right here. Now remember, it doesn't have to be the whole thing, it's just got to be your cross member that fits in there. So you don't have to sand everything down, but just enough so that your cross member can bind well. So now that I've been able to sand down all my joints, what we want to do is take your block, and then we're going to use this so that we can get this at a nice right angle, because we don't want it tilted at all. If it's tilted, then we're going to get weird loading. So we want to make sure it's as straight as possible. So what you're going to do is try to line it up on your bottom projection with all the joints matching the cross members. And when you get it in place, go ahead and pin it down. And then make sure that this thing isn't flexing in. What you're gonna wanna do is get some tape and actually tape it. So get some tension on this member, hold it down. And you don't wanna flex it out, but you also do wanna tape it back to the 2x4. Or actually 2x2.5. So it doesn't have to be under a lot of tension, it's just gotta be enough to keep it up completely vertical. So now I'm ready to glue on my cross members. So make sure you got your gloves back on when you're ready to glue the cross members. I'm just gonna dip them in a little bit of the epoxy. Get it at a nice angle, and remember, prior to this I sanded it down, so this should give me a nice bond here. And even to push it up against there, what I'm going to do is pin it on the ends so that it gets a good amount of force. Because we want to make sure that while it's curing, it's being pressed into place. It's okay if there's a little bit of flex on it. Just make sure that you get it bonded well. So now that my one side has set up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add the second side, and then we're going to secure it in place to be the right angle with the other block of wood. So to do that, I'll get another little stick and I'll paint these guys right here. Get them, go ahead and paint onto the connections for your other truss. Go ahead and snug it up there really good. And remember, just like before, now this time, actually we taped it. What I'm actually gonna do, I'm gonna get one of these cross members up to get some support here. And actually, I don't like the way that this is looking, so I'm not able to get enough pressure here. So what I'm going to do is actually come in on these pin joints and make sure, because I have to get this well connected on the bottom, so I'm going to come in and make sure that it is well pressed in on the bottom. And then what I'll do is I'll take this wood block. You could come in from the side so you can just kind of get a good feel if it's looking level, but I'm not actually going to use it. So it's looking pretty level, but so I'm gonna actually, what I'm gonna do is let it be without actually putting the second block on, because I've got more force on my members here with just using the pins. So whatever your preference is, if it's nice and flush, mine didn't quite get there, so that's why I'm using the pins for the second side.